I mean, the list can go on for these kind of diseases that we're starting to identify, right? Parainfluenza is another one that kind of falls into the same category. But I mean, personally, that's why I find swine medicine so interesting. Everyone always says every 10 years there's a new disease that comes along, right? But it seems like right now with the technology and everything that we have now, it seems like a more frequent thing happening. But yeah, it's just trying to evaluate that, right? So looking at it, trying not to be biased, but looking at it with an open mind and trying to ask the questions of, is there something else here? Is this truly the only thing here that could be causing these issues, right? So
welcome to Swine Canada. My name is John Patience, your host for today's podcast. And with us today, we have Dr. Ryan Tenbergen, a swine veterinarian associated with Demeter Veterinary Services. He will be talking about Streptococcus zooepidemicus and some viruses and emerging pathogens that he thinks we should be more aware of. So welcome, Ryan. How are you today?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to our discussion today.
Well, I am too. And Ryan, I'm sure that many people that are listening today will know you or know of you, but on the chance that there are people who are not familiar with your background and training, could you give us a bit of a biography of yourself and where you started out and how you got to be here where you are today?
Yes, for sure. So I grew up in a small town in Ontario here in Canada. I went to school wanting to be a vet, but in all honesty, I was going to go be a small animal vet. And just in school, I had some summer job opportunities. I got to work with some swine vets, work on some farms, and I kind of just fell in love with it. So from there on, I continued to work on farms. I did a master's of science in swine health management, learned a lot, presented a lot around Canada and in the US too. And then from there on to vet school. And now I'm a partner in my clinic here in Ontario. So we oversee around 100,000 sows just over in Ontario here, but we also part of the larger swine vet partner group, which oversee around 400,000 sows in Canada. So you have a pretty good reach and a good group of 17 veterinarians in total.
Wow, that's an impressive background, and I'm particularly impressed that you were doing a master's degree at the same time, if I understand correctly, at the same time that you were doing a DVM.
Just before, actually. So yeah, finish that first. I don't know if I could have done both at the same time. Yeah.
I was going to say, for us mortals, that would be impossible. Okay, yeah. I'm glad I got that clarified. Good. Well, thanks very much for that introduction, and obviously you're in a good position to help us out today to understand some of these pathogens that are affecting our industry. And first off, I guess we're going to talk a little bit about Streptococcus zooepidemicus, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the organism, but maybe more critically, why you think it's important that we talk about it today.
Sure. Yeah. And unfortunately, I have firsthand experience with this pathogen, and not a lot of veterinarians do. I think, the more I talk to different colleagues in Canada, in US, everywhere, it is becoming more of an issue globally. So my firsthand experience was back in 2020. So I had a farm break with this horrendous disease. It's very, 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 very aggressive on a farm, causes very, very high mortality. And we don't really know a lot about it as far as how to treat it and how to handle it. So, we can try some vaccines, we can try some antibiotics. It just really nothing seems to work. And then a little bit about it. It's really, really common in a lot of species. So it's multiple species that'll affect. So horses, you'll routinely find it in horses. It can be dogs, ruminants, pigs, humans even, right? So it is a zoonotic disease that can infect humans. And there's lots of really interesting case studies done. There's one in Italy about some unpasteurized milk. There's another one in Thailand that goes back to a lot of cases and looks at when this pathogen is evolved. And it's definitely pretty severe in all of those species. But what's interesting about it is that it's a commensal. And what I mean by that is that it's part of the normal bacterial flora of some of these animals, right? So in horses, you'll find it in their respiratory tracts, but it can cause strangles, which most people will know. So that kind of really upper respiratory disease in horses. Now, how it makes the jumps to pigs and other species like that, that's where we're kind of in the dark a little bit. In the case that I had, there really was no direct contact, so we were really left kind of scratching our heads as where this came from, right? And that's where kind of the worst part of this all is, because you have someone that's gone through this devastating disease, and they've been impacted, financially in their production, the mental health aspects of it, of losing animals, not being able to do anything for them, and then not being able to figure out where it came from. So I think that's one of the hardest things of this all.
Can we talk about that just a little bit more? I think we found everybody's familiar with the story of COVID, of course, and the story of where it did or did not come from. But I think we all remember that for the medical community to have some understanding of the origin of that particular pathogen was really important for them to be able to start to develop treatments or preventative measures that would make sense. They started at ground zero, basically, and had to learn very, very quickly because human lives were at risk. So your point about starting out at a very difficult situation where you don't know where the organism came from is probably really, really difficult for you professionally. But can you help me? And I wonder if some of our listeners are thinking, but we do know about Streptococcus. So is there anything that we know about Streptococcus that would help in terms of how you would approach this particular Streptococcus strain?
Yes. So, I mean, in theory, because they're both streptococcuses, as you say, then, those same approaches for control would work. But unfortunately, with this pathogen, just because of the sheer aggressiveness of it, or the magnitude of disease that it causes, it's something that's very, very difficult to stop. So, like I mentioned, we tried in my specific case, and I know there's a few other cases in Canada. There was Manitoba was kind of the first emergence of this pathogen a year before I saw it here in Ontario, and then even most recently, just in 2023, there was another case in Alberta. So more and more cases are popping up. But yes, I think all of those. I mean, I've talked to those veterinarians that deal with those herds, and it's really we're thinking on that same theory. Okay, beta lactams that work really, really well against Streptococcus species. Can we use that? You use that, and you'll kind of knock it down a little bit as soon as you remove that antibiotic or that treatment. Mortality can start again. So that's what's the really challenging thing. A little bit of work has been done with vaccines, and there's some interesting things too that we'll probably touch on as we go through here. But again, nothing's really been proven in that. Myself and those cases in Manitoba, we've tried making these autogenous vaccines, right? So taking that bacteria that you grow in your specific farm and making a vaccine for it, we just can't seem to be successful with that to date.
Wow. So I don't want to move you forward more quickly than you want, Ryan. So if I'm moving it forward, feel free to pull me back a bit. But can you, well, the first question I have is a very simple one, and that is the other instances of the outbreak is the severity similar? Is there a range in the impact in a herd, or is it pretty typical that it's going to have the same impact? It's a TGE, PED kind of thing, or is it more like a PRRS or something that sometimes it hits hard and sometimes it doesn't?
Sure. So I would say the severity is very similar. So I mean, I can talk a little bit of specifics on my case. My case, we ended up having 40% sow mortality, right? That's significant. Wow. Yeah. And you look at, there was actually, there's been a few sporadic cases in the US too, but one kind of the classic ones when everyone started to look at Strep Zoo a little bit was a Tennessee sow assembly yard. And it ended up getting into that assembly yard, and they lost 40% of the sows in that assembly yard very, very quickly, right? So really acute deaths. And it's the kind of thing where, this is the frustration of it too, is, you're highly vigilant and going in, trying to individually treat animals as you go through this, right? So, you notice that a sow has been off feed, or maybe she's breathing heavily. So you'll go and try and treat her. Oftentimes that's unsuccessful, but if you don't catch her that morning when you're going in, if you do not treat her, then you can guarantee the next day that unfortunately she'll be dead. So it's just that really, really acute death. So really, really high numbers. And then those other cases out in the West too. Again, very, very similar. It usually starts with this just really high spike of mortality, right? So just very, very suddenly, all of a sudden you'll have, I know the case in Alberta, it's 69 sows dead on the weekend. So it really, really hits hard.
Wow. Can you maybe help our listeners to know what are the symptoms? Mortality is obviously the big one, and if the pigs die so darn quickly, the symptoms maybe becomes a bit of a moot point. But what are some of the symptoms that a producer might go into his barn and say, "Oh my God, I got to get on this right away," because this looked like what Dr. Ryan was saying on that podcast I listened to?
Yeah. So unfortunately, because the mortality will start so heavily, that is going to be your first indicator, right? There really is nothing that indicates anything before that, and all of a sudden you'll just get this big spike of mortality like that. So obviously at that point, I mean, yeah, if you're in your barn and you notice that, I mean, the first call you should be making is your veterinarian, right? And trying to get some samples done, some fresh samples. And even just discussing with some of the other colleagues here in Canada and that, I mean, something like this, it looks a lot like something like African swine fever, right? Where you all of a sudden get this huge burst of mortality. So it really should be something that we don't I hope no one would turn an eye to, but it should be something that we kind of make the right calls to and look at.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, well, for whatever reason, there's all kinds of reasons then, as you're stating, to get on top of this thing right away and not to delay. Okay, very good. I'm a bit of a scientist. Maybe not all our listeners will share this, but can you tell me a little bit about the course of the disease? So how is it causing mortality?
Yes, so it's direct contact transmission as far as we know, right? So it's nose to nose contact. Water troughs definitely make it bad if those are shared, because it can just spread in the water there. And then it's really just an acute septicemia, right? So as far as, if as a veterinarian, of course, what I do is my bread and butter is go in and cut things open, right? So you go in, you'll cut sows open, and you won't see a whole lot grossly, to be honest. You'll see some mild signs of septicemia, right? So maybe some reddening of those organs. Definitely a large spleen is one thing that will pop up. But other than that, it's very, very subtle just because of the acute nature of it. But when you do culture it, it's pretty clear that that's the only thing you culture, and you culture nothing else.
Oh, really?
Yeah, really, yeah.
So I guess the next question is that the pig industry is going through really, really difficult times right now. The markets are awful, and the prospect in the next number of months does not look any better. So here we come along, and we're talking about something else that pork producers have to deal with. So let's put it into a context. I think it's really important, and you've just given us very good reasons, Ryan, why we need to know about it. And I'm glad we're doing this podcast, because this is something that you just can't mess around with. You got to get on top of. But can you give me a bit more of a sense, and our listeners a bit more of a sense, of how common it is, and do you have a sense yet of how infectious it is? So it's one thing for an organism to be fatal, and it's another thing for it to be, to be highly infectious or very difficult to transmit. Where does this particular organism fall into that spectrum?
Sure. Yeah, I can give a little bit of my input. So, I'll just mention through this all, Dr. Matthias Costa at University of Saskatoon, the vet college there. I mean, I would say he's kind of, in my eyes, a leading expert in this right now. So I've talked a lot with him. He's done a lot of work on it. But as far as this organism, I mean, infectious wise, very easy to transmit, right? So once it gets into a herd, it's very easy to move within the herd. It will move quickly. I think sorry, pause for a minute. I lost my train of thought.
That's
Your
okay.
question was
Don't
two
take your time.
parts there.
Yeah, basically it was infectivity. It has high mortality, but the other question is the in how infectious it is, and that's so at how much of a risk am I as a pork producer at in terms of contracting this disease in my barn?
Okay. All right. So after we talk about Matthias Costa, yes, so we can talk about infectivity. So yeah. So uh, so as far as how infectious it is, it really does move really quickly through a herd. So the infectivity of it is very, very high. It spreads very quickly and will cause widespread sickness. As far as risk within the industry, as a producer, should we be worried? Should we be not? Of course, we should be worried because of the magnitude of the disease. Now, the cases are rare to date, right? So like I mentioned, if we go back to 2019, so 4 years ago, we've had 3 cases in Canada. You have some sporadic cases in the US, which I'm not sure the number on that specifically, but talking to Dr. Costa, who I mentioned, he does say he knows that there's some other cases happening globally. So that's where the whole question of is this an emerging pathogen coming that we kind of need to put a lot of attention on and figure out a way of how to early identify it, right? How to prevent the spread of it. I think that's some of the questions being asked right now. And most recently, too, SHIC, the Swine Health Information Center in the U.S. So they're kind of a organization that really looks at diseases and puts priority on them and does a lot of very, very good research. So they've put this on their list of kind of diseases to watch. So I think at least in North America and I hope globally, I think people are putting an eye on this. I think risk right now in your farm is probably low, but that's probably a bad thing to say too, because we're not really sure how it comes into a herd, right? And that's the hard thing to tease out of it. It's something like I mentioned when we talked about the organism to start. It's a commensal in a lot of animals, so it's just part of that normal bacteria that they have in their upper respiratory tract. Now, what causes a trigger that causes it to cause disease? That's kind of the biggest thing that we don't know. But I will say that one thing that's come through all of this, if you look at human case studies, if you look at different animal case studies, it is just one strain of this bacteria that is causing this really, really high mortality, right? So my strain was sequenced from Ontario. I know the Alberta strain was sequenced, and they all match. They're all within 99.8 or 9% similarity. It's all the same strain.
Right. Okay. But because it's a commensal organism, that again makes it particularly challenged for the veterinary community as well as pork producers to deal with it. Because, as you said, the big question is what's the trigger? What causes it from
what is the trigger?
being commensal to being to causing disease or
yeah, and we don't really know how widespread it is too, right? Because it's not like we're out testing healthy animals for this, and it is a hard thing to test. I mean, tonsil swabs are probably the best way to test for it. But again, you test a tonsil, there's a lot of other stuff in a tonsil too. So yeah, there really hasn't been, to my knowledge, any kind of healthy animal testing in pigs. So yeah, maybe that's something to look at in the future as we try and learn more about it too.
I think it strikes me as I'm listening to you, Ryan, that this is another example of where doing those things in the barn to maintain a stable microbiome within that animal becomes really important. And so I'll put a little bit of a plug in for one of my favorite topics, and that is that we need to understand the microbiome better, and we need to understand what influences it and what we can do to maintain it. But obviously, we already know that the manner in which we treat our animals, the stress that we put them under, whether it's environmental stress, social stress, any of those stressors can have a big impact on the microbiome. So it sounds like in this particular case, there's nothing specific to say about it, but just again, for producers to be alerted, this is a topic we need to understand better and they need to learn more about.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And I think there's some really exciting things being done right now in that kind of world of research, right, of microbiome. And even you talk of another streptococcus, Strep suis, which we deal with on a daily basis, right? Like there's so much coming out now about the relationship between disease with Strep suis and gut health, right? And just all goes back to that whole microbiome idea. So yeah, no, I think there's some really interesting things that will come out with that in the next few years.
Yeah. Okay. So was there anything else you wanted to say on you abbreviate it nicely to Strep Zoo? I appreciate that. And is there anything else you wanted to say about that before we move to other pathogens?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think, I think it's nice that we're all aware on it and we talk about it, right? And like I said, Dr. Costa at University of Saskatoon, he's doing some really, really good work, and he's developed what seems to be a potentially very promising vaccine too. So I think over the next few years that there'll be some more on this, and fingers crossed, no more true cases on farm. But it's just something that we need to, keep our eye on and make sure that we don't give it the attention that it needs, because it's very, very devastating. You don't want to see it anywhere else.
Absolutely. Good. Well, we still have some time left, Ryan. So let's talk about, you wanted to talk about some other organisms or pathogens, excuse me, that you think would be worthy of discussion today. And I'm sure there's a great long list you could talk about, but are there some that are that you feel in particular that we should include in this particular podcast?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. And I don't want to be all doom and gloom here, but veterinary medicine, it's at a very interesting point right now, especially swine, other species, I'm sure too, but where our testing capabilities are becoming so much better than what they used to be, right? And like the whole concept of whole genome sequencing, where you can take a sample and look at every single bacteria and virus in there. So there's going to be a lot of different pathogens that are going to pop up, and we're going to try and have to understand, are they important? Are they not important? A lot of these pathogens kind of fall into that same commensal category, right? So finding in a healthy animal, but also potentially finding in a sick animal. So yeah, I think over the next few years, when all that just keeps being, more affordable, more developing, we're going to have a lot of things come up. One thing I did want to touch on though is Porcine Astrovirus 4. I find this one very, very interesting. And we have definitely a confirmed case within our clinic. So we've done a lot of talking together at, we do normal vet rounds and things like that. So we've done a lot of chatting together. And that one specifically really speaks to me, to something that I just wanted to chat about today, and kind of give the picture of, we're going to keep learning here. We're going to keep trying to understand this stuff. So as a really quick introduction to Porcine Astrovirus 4. So the case that we had, it's coughing in basically due to wean pigs, or just after weaning pigs. And what really, you always hear the saying of what looks like a duck and walks like a duck must be a duck, right? So whenever we think of, a coughing wean pig, the first thing you always think of is influenza. And there's, I could probably count on, I probably need more than two hands to count the number of cases that I'm sure, based on clinically what I'm seeing, that I think it's influenza. You'll do testing, maybe 2 rounds or 3 rounds of testing, and you can't find it, right? And it's frustrating. And we've always kind of been of the thought of, oh, I just didn't sample at the right time, or I didn't pick the right pigs, right? But we think, hey, clinically it's there, it must be influenza. But now you put Porcine Astrovirus 4 in the picture, and potentially some of these cases, these complicated cases where we can't really put a finger on exactly what it is, even though we think that, something like that could be the cause of it. There was a really, really interesting study I read from Iowa, actually. So similar to what I just explained, pathologists are great. They're so knowledgeable. I'm always bouncing ideas off of pathologists, but these pathologists at Iowa, they went back in their archive and they picked out 1,200 cases that really, when you look at under the microscope, they thought, hey, there is something going on here. It looks like influenza. There's airway damage, and they don't actually isolate influenza from those cases, right? So again, it goes back to that whole thing: we didn't sample the right time, didn't pick the right pigs, whatever you want to choose. So, anyways, they took those 1,200 cases and they tested them all for porcine astrovirus 4. And it's funny, as I listened to a podcast with them, and they said they expected maybe 20-30% would come up positive, and that would be a win for them, right? They think, yeah, there seems to be an association there, but 70% of those cases came up positive for porcine astrovirus 4, right? So it really puts a lot of evidence on the fact that that virus is there causing that disease.
Wow. And so so are there other clinical symptoms that are associated with it other than coughing? Or, is it a dry cough? Is it because when you go into a barn, a cough is not always a cough, right? So if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. No, so it honestly really is a cough. And I mean, I think it could mix between a dry and maybe what I call a wet or productive cough, right? Just depending on what kind of other secondary stuff's going on. But mortality is actually very low. Most of the pigs will cough. The vet within our practice that has been dealing with this case mostly, he said, I think it was, 30-40% of the pigs he thought were coughing. But they keep eating, they keep growing. You don't lose too many pigs, but it's just that nagging cough that everyone kind of hears, and you can't really get rid of. So yeah. Other than that, it's really just that cough, and a lot of there's not a whole lot of, I guess, ideas on how to treat this right now, how to prevent it. A lot of cases you read about right now, they'll have some cases, and then all of a sudden they won't have it anymore. Right. So, yeah. And, whenever you think of something new, I know of some cases where veterinarians have tried a form of feedback, right? Just, it's kind of ingrained in our mind. If we get something new, to expose the population, right? That's how we work in population medicine. So I know some have tried feedback. But again, it's kind of, we're in the world here of something new that we're still trying to learn about. Is it going to become more important? Is it going to become less important? I mean, all that's still to see. But I guess the point of talking about it is that some of those complicated cases that I have personally I know have happened to others. We have some of these other viruses here that may not be on our radar. So maybe, we should be testing and looking at some of these things too.
Right. Well, it's a very interesting point, Ryan. So dealing with coughing, dealing with respiratory disease, you now have a bit of expanded knowledge as to what might be going on and what you might want to be looking for. And also the good news is that the pigs seem to still be eating and still growing. It'd be nice to have a control study where you could look and say, yes, they're eating and growing, but they're only at 80% of normal, or they're perfectly normal. And we really, it's just another pathogen that if too many of them pile up, we could have a much bigger problem if we aren't careful.
Yeah, no, you bet. Yeah. So maybe, we'll learn more. And I mean, the list can go on for these kind of diseases that we're starting to identify, right? Parainfluenza is another one that kind of falls into the same category. But personally, that's why I find swine medicine so interesting. There's, everyone always says every 10 years there's a new disease that comes along, right? But it seems like right now with the technology and everything that we have now, it seems like a more frequent thing happening. But yeah, it's just trying to evaluate that, right? So looking at it, trying not to be biased, but looking at it with an open mind and trying to ask the questions of, is there something else here? Is this truly the only thing here that could be causing these issues, right? So yeah, I think that's kind of part of why I love what I do, for sure.
Absolutely. And it's clear that you do love what you do, Ryan, just listening to you. And as I listen to you as well, I'm reminded of a comment made by Dr. Ernie Peo, who was a very, very well-known swine nutrition researcher at the University of Nebraska years ago. He's now passed, but he trained some of our more prominent nutritionists in the U.S. and around the world. And his comment was a little bit sardonic, was the questions never change. It's just the answers that change. And as I listened to you and some of the, you're seeing these phenomena and you're trying to understand them and treat them and so on. So the phenomenon may be the same, mortality, coughing, etc., but the answers are definitely changing. And unfortunately, sometimes the outcome is as well. Did you have any other final comments on these these pathogens before we move on to the final phase of our podcast?
No, I don't think so. I think the main point was just I guess give the message that we're learning. We're finding new things. We're trying to take that with a grain of salt and use our professional knowledge and experience to think of the best way to deal with that. So I think I think the next few years will definitely be very, very interesting as we start to use some of this new technology. And it'll be good time in the swine world, I think, for veterinarians to apply their knowledge.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I think was really useful in this podcast, Ryan, was that you've helped give us insight when you're faced with a new pathogen, and you know a little bit about it, but not enough, and how you go about it, how you go about trying to deal with it, whether it's something which has relatively low mortality and doesn't appear to affect performance very much, or another organism which is devastating. Your approach sounds really, I think, is really informative for us. So thank you for sharing that with us.
I just want to say, like, the veterinary profession, especially globally, but in North America, we're so great to share information and share experiences, right? I never shy away from calling another practitioner in the US or out West. And I think that's a really, good thing for the swine industry, and something that we should really be happy about, that we're so open and transparent to share information and our experiences. And I think that's just better for the global industry as a whole.
Absolutely. Good point. Yeah, good point. Thanks. And timely.
It's time for our famous three. Swine Veterinary Partners offers a full range of animal health and production services to Canadian pork producers. We approach health management through personalized solution with concern for profitability while taking into account performance and the well-being of your animals.
So moving on then, I have three typical questions that we like to ask our guests on our podcast. And the first question I have for you is, what is the book related to swine that you would recommend to our listeners as a book that you think is a very good book to read or a good book for references?
Yeah, so unfortunately, with my job, I'm on the road a lot and I don't read a whole lot. I have young kids at home too. So, for a reference, of course, the gold standard for myself, I honestly check it, I would say weekly, monthly, whatever you want to say, but, Diseases of Swine for a veterinarian is just kind of the given, right? But other than that, unless you're really, really, really interested in kind of disease and science and things like that. So that would just kind of be my go-to if you think of anything swine. Yeah.
Okay. And the second question then is, do you have a favorite book or resource that you really like, but not from a professional point of view, but from a personal point of view? And you've already said you don't have time to read professional books very much. So I assume you don't have a whole lot of time to read, adventure books, but is there a book that you can think of that you read at some point that you particularly enjoyed?
Yeah, John, we talked about this at the start, like even a podcast. I can't tell you, John. I think we're going to have to skip this question. Yeah.
Yep, that's fine. Nope, no problem.
Okay.
Nobody says you have to answer
really
every
can't.
question.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Well, then the last one is the question that I like the most, and that is that as you've now been in the industry for a number of years, what are the characteristics of people in the swine world that you think that the most successful people in our industry, what are characteristics that they have which separate them from other people who are perhaps less successful in our industry?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And as we talked about this today, and new diseases and learning more, I think one of the main things is just having an open mind. I think, I always say to veterinarians that I work with, associates, and even producers, right? We're dealing with biology here, right? There's no one answer. Things are complicated. So I try not to get so hyper focused on one thing, right? And Porcine Astrovirus 4. I can't go in and think this is influenza and this is nothing else, right? I need to have that open mind to look for other things and try new things too, right? So as we try and deal with some of this, there's no playbook for every disease. So be confident to be able to try some new things and new innovations and do your job to assess those appropriately, right? So I think that's the biggest thing for me is just don't get so much set on one diagnosis or something like that, right? Really keep that open mind and try and consider all things.
Right. Great. Well, and maybe there's another characteristic that you've demonstrated in the little over half hour that we've been chatting, and that is be a good communicator. You've done a wonderful job with this, Ryan, and I thank you for it. But unfortunately, time is up, and you've got things to do and places to be, and our listeners do as well. So I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us today and giving of your time today, and want to wish you a good rest of the day and rest of the week. So thank you very much, Ryan.
Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you as well.